for 4-3 problems, we know if it's over 4, so I know that pi over 4, we're looking at square root 2 over 2 and square root 2 over 2. So sine I know is just this, so sine would be square root 2 over 2. Cosine, so minus square root 2 over 2 would be the cosine. So this answer is just 0. All right, so pi over 3, I know here the values would be 1/2 and square root 3, 2. So if I'm thinking cosine, I know cosine, this first part is just the x value, so this first part is just 1/2. Secant is the inverse of cosine. So this would be, instead of 1 over 2, it'd be 2 over 1, or just multiplied by 2. And then cotangent, I know cotangent is x over y. So that'd be the minus, and then I'm going to have 1/2 and divide by square root 3 over 2, or 1/2 times 2 over square root 3. So here the 2's would cancel, and this would be then 1 over square root 3. Multiply by square root 3 over square root 3. And what do I get? Square root 3 over 3. So this final answer, 1/2 times 2, is just 1. And so it'd be 1 minus square root 3 over 3. And that would be our answer there for 18. So for this problem, what things do I have? I have opposite, and I have the hypotenuse. So this would be our opposite, and the c would be our hypotenuse. So what things do I know that's opposite? So I know that sine of 23 then has to equal the opposite, has to equal 16 over c. So therefore, if I multiply c times the sine of 23, has to equal 16. And now I can divide both sides by the sine of 23. So c would have to equal 16 divided by the sine of 23. And just plug that in your calculator. So 16 is equal to sine divided by sine of 23. And there's your answer. For this type of problem here, if it says sine of theta is less than 0, what does that mean? We know sine is talking about y. This means that y is negative. If cosine is greater than 0, that means that x has got to be positive. So where is y negative? So here x is positive, y is negative, so this would have to be in quadrant 4. So looking at tangent, so thinking about how this relates, we know that tangent relates y and x, right? Because it's y divided by x. So in order for it to be negative, either y has to be negative and x be positive, or x is negative and y is positive. So either one of those scenarios has to happen. Well, here it says sine is negative, so that means y has to be negative. So that means I have to be y negative, x positive. So x positive, y negative. So here x is positive, y is negative, so I have to be, once again, in quadrant 4. All right, for cotangent, cotangent I know is defined as x divided by y. So in order for it to be positive, either x is positive and y is positive, or x is negative and y is negative. So one of those two scenarios makes a cotangent that's positive. Here's secant. Secant is related to cosine, or secant is also 1 over the x. So here, for it to be negative, x has to be negative. So I know I have to have x negative and therefore y negative. So I have to be x negative, y negative, and have to be down in quadrant 3. All right, here, if I'm looking, I want to find all the different values, so I can kind of build that off the triangle. All right, so here, if I'm thinking cosine, I know cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so this has to be -3, this has to be 5. If I'm in quadrant 3, that tells me that x is negative and y is negative. So here I got a 3, 4, 5 triangle, so this has to be -4. And I could easily find all of the different values. So I know that sine would have to be -4 over 5. I know that tangent would have to be then 4 over 3. I know that So here it said, already said cosine was negative 3 over 5. Sine secant, cosecant, we know is just the inverse of sine, so this would have to be negative 5 over 4. Cotangent, inverse of tangent, would have to be 3 over 4. And secant is just the inverse of cosine, would have to be negative 5 over 3. And there's all of our different trig identities, and these work exactly the same way. Only difference on these is now just got to really kind of pay attention to what pieces are what here. So for tangent, it says it's negative 2, 3. So I know that this is 2. I know that this is 3. It says that sine is positive, so I know y has to be positive. So therefore I know that this has to be negative. And then I just got to find this other piece. So what would that be? So I know it's c equals square root of a squared plus b squared, right? Which would be 9 plus 4, or it'd be square root 13. And then I could just work through and figure out all the different pieces. So I know sine would be 3 over square root 13 and multiply by square root 13 over 13 over square root 13. So I get 3 square root 13 over 13, and that would be that one. And you can just go through and figure all those out pretty easily. So I'll let you guys do those. And there were all the other identities and answers for 29 is what you should have gotten for those. All right, for 34, if the cosecant is negative 4, I know cosecant is 1 over the y. All right, so I know that this has to be, then in order for that to be the case, our sine value would have to be what? Sine would have to be negative 1/4. So this would have to be 4. This would have to be 1. The one thing I don't know yet is, so here it tells me that tangent, the only way that tangent can be positive is either x is positive or y is positive, or x is negative and y is negative. So in order for cosecant to be negative, so I know that has to be negative, and that means that this down here has to be negative, whatever that is. So we can work that out. So I know I got c squared equals a squared plus b squared. So this would have to be 16 equals 1 plus whatever b squared is. So this would have to be square root of 15, or negative square root 15. Once you have your triangle filled out, then we can go through and identify all the other pieces. So it's really easy to figure out sine. We know sine is the inverse of cosecant, so this has to be negative 1/4. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, has to be negative square root 15 over 4. Tangent, we know would be negative, so it would be 1 over square root 15, or once I multiply by square root 15 over square root 15, I'd end up with square root 15 over 15 would be the tangent. Cosecant's already given to me, secant inverse of cosine. So this would be then negative 4 over square root 15, and I'd multiply by square root 15. And I would have negative 4 square root 15 over 15. And cotangent is the inverse, we know is the inverse of tangent. So instead of being 1 over the square root 15, it'd be square root 15 over 1. And so there's all of our identities for 34. All right, here, if it says tangent of negative pi/4, so I know I'm going backwards, so this would be 0, this would be a half, this would be 1. So I know negative pi/4 should have to be in this range right here. So if I'm looking at the values, I know since it's over 4, I know it's square root 2 over 2 and square root 2 over 2. And down here we know x is positive, y is negative. So if I'm looking at the tangent, so y over x, this would end up being negative 1. Cotangent of 7 pi over 4. All right, so 7 pi over 4. Well, once again, this would be 0. So now I'm going forward. This would be 0. This would be a half. This would be 1. This would be 1.5. This would be 2. Well, 7 over 4 is the same as what? It's 1, so not quite 2. So I'm more than 1.5, but not quite 2. So I'm in this range right here. So I know that since it's over 4, we got square root 2 and 2, and square root 2 and 2. Your x is positive, y is negative. So cotangent would here once again be -1. All right, so 23 over 4, that's the same as 5 3/4. So let's figure out where is that. So 0, this would be a half, right? Going around the circle, 1, 1.5. This would be back to 2. Then we'd be at 2.5, be at 3, would be at 3.5, and be at 4, would be at 4.5. This would be 5 around the circle. This would be 5.5. And 5 3/4 then would be right in there. So once again, so since it's divided by 4, I know it has to be square root 2 and square root 2, square root 2 and square root 2. And here x is positive, y is negative, and there's my value. And I'm looking at cosine, so cosine I know is just the x coordinate, so this would be square root 2 square root over 2, and there's the answer. All right, 35 over 6, that is the same as what? 5 5/6. So I know this would be 0, then back around again, here it would be 2, back around again, this would be 4. So if I continued on, so this would be once around the circle, twice around the circle, this would be 4.5, this would be 5, this would be 5.5, and I'd be in this quadrant 4 again on this problem. So I'm looking at, since it's divided by 6, we know that the first one is square root 3, 2, the second one 1/2. Here in quadrant 4, we know x is positive, y is negative. Cosine, I know I'm looking for the x value. So this is square root 3 and 2, and that would be our answer there. All right, when you're trying to graph things, we need to know a couple different pieces. I need to know the amplitude. I need to know what is the period. And I need to know, is there any kind of phase shift? All right, so here the amplitude is just 1. Here the period is defined as what? We know it's defined as 2 pi divided by b. So b is 2. So 2 pi divided by 2, and that tells me that the period is pi. The phase shift is defined as c divided by b. So we know c is 1/2. So if I do 1/2 divided by 2, I get then, this would be then pi fourths. All right, so once I know I have these 4 subsections, I know that we have to break these into the period into 4 groups. So the first one would be a fourth. Then I add one more fourth, and this would be then pi halves. And then I add one more fourth, and this would be 3 over 4, and then up to pi. And I know it goes up to 1 down to -1. And I know that sine starts at 0 and goes to amplitude, down to 0, down to amplitude, and up to 0. And so there is our pi graph, our sine graph, showing one full period. Okay? Now I'm just going to really look and see what happens according to our phase shift. So if it's by pi force, we know, and also if it's minus, I know I'm moving everything to the right. So I'm just going to move all of these to the right, one section of pi to the fourth. So I'm moving all these to the right, one group of pi to the fourth. So this would move over there, this would move over here, and this would be then at the end would be 5 pi over 4. So that would be our new shifted sine graph, would look like that. And so that would be our full graph showing the phase shift and the graph of the one period of the function.